So now we have an opportunity to learn more about our speakers for today. And although Norman Kuntz and Emma Vandercliff are well-known speakers and advocates throughout the disability rights community, they prefer to think of themselves as modern-day storytellers, continuing the long-held tradition of using humor and narrative to initiate self-reflection and social change. Norman and Emma have traveled extensively through North America and abroad, providing in-service and training in the areas of inclusive education, employment equity, conflict resolution, and other disability rights issues. Norma and Emma's first book, Being Realistic Isn't Realistic, is a collection of their writings on disability, identity, inclusion, and innovation. In addition to this, Emma has recently published Talk to Me, What Educators and Others Can Learn About De-Escalation from Hostage Negotiators. Born with cerebral palsy, Norman attended a segregated school for children with disabilities. Then at age 13, he was integrated into a regular school. From there, he went on to complete a bachelor's degree in humanities and a master's degree in family therapy. In his undergraduate years, Norman wrote a book about his experiences of going to a regular school. This book catapulted him into a career as a speaker, writer, scholar, and advocate.
Emma Vandercliff is a neurodivergent speaker, author, and activist. Recently diagnosed as a person with autism, she has embraced the diagnosis with a sense of relief, recognition, and confirmation. Although she worked in a nonprofit sector supporting individuals with developmental and intellectual disabilities for many years, like many other girls and women with autism, she didn't recognize her experience as represented in the common societal narratives. Since discovering a supportive and vibrant community of adults and allies with autism, she's become an active member in the neurodiversity movement. Emma holds a master's degree in conflict analysis and management for Royal Roads University and was certified as a mediator negotiator through the Justice Institute in Vancouver. She sometimes wonders if she might be the only mediator with autism. And with that, we would like to warmly welcome Norman and Emma.
Hi, I'm Norman Kuntz.
And I'm Emma Vandercliff.
And we're really delighted that you've asked us to speak at your conference.
All right, so let's talk about how we're going to do this. Typically when Norm and I present together, we take turns, and we're going to do the same thing in this particular video version of something that we usually do live. And so sometimes Norm will be speaking, and then other times I will, and sometimes we might even interrupt each other because that's the downside of presenting with your significant other. So we hope you'll bear with us.
And by the way, for you observant ones who really get committed to looking at continuity in feature films, you'll notice my hair changes in different sections of the film. That's because we shot different sections of this video before and after my COVID haircut, just so you know. So we hope you enjoy this. Here we go. So I thought I'd start off by giving you a bit more detailed description of my background. Emma and I believe that it's important that you know the people who are presenting to you as people. Otherwise, the ideas that we put forward sort of hang in the air. Whereas if you know us, you can understand where those ideas came from. So, as was mentioned in the introduction, I went to a segregated school for disabled kids up to 13, and at that time I argued myself into regular junior high school in my neighborhood. Now at that time there were no models for inclusion or integration, so for me it came down to basic problem solving. How do I take notes in class? How do I do math on typewriter? I took all the subjects. I took, phys ed, math, shop. Yes, you heard me right. I did 4 years of shop, and in case you're wondering, yes, I still have all my fingers. My shop teacher became an alcoholic, but I'm fine. After that, I went into regular high school and moved on there to an undergrad in humanities and master's degree in family therapy. While I was in my undergrad, I wrote a book to document some of the hacks I came up with so I could participate in regular school, and that book got published. So when my master's finished, I already had a career speaking to educators. And at that point, I had to figure out, do I take the safe, ordinary job as a family therapist, or do I take this more romantic job as a public speaker? I figured, I'll do public speaking for 1 year, and if I don't starve, I'll keep doing it. So here I am. I didn't starve.
Okay, I'm going to give you a brief introduction of who I am, but I'm not doing it right now, and there's a reason for that. That will become evident as we go along. So I'm just going to dive right in and start with the first part of our presentation. You're going to see some PowerPoints up on the screen, and sometimes you'll see our faces again. So here goes. There's an old joke that we heard is also a Sufi parable, and it goes like this. One night, a cop is walking his beat in a very, very dark part of town. And he looks around, and underneath the street light, there's a man. And the man is down on his hands and knees, seems to be looking for something. So the policeman goes up to him and says, "What are you doing?" And the guy says, "Well, I lost my keys." And the cop says, "Well, where'd you lose them?" And he says, "Well, I lost them over there," and points away from the street light. So the policeman looks at him confused and says, "Well, if you lost them over there, why are you looking over here?" And the man said, "Well, the light's better over here." We believe that this is what we've been doing in early childhood education and in inclusive education and even beyond when it comes to kids with disabilities. We've often been looking where we believe the light is best, where there's evidence-based material, etc. We've gone to the experts. We'd like to suggest that we may have lost those keys somewhere else, and what we really need to do is to take out our flashlights, Nancy Drew style, and look for those keys in other places. So here's what we mean by that. Typically, when we've thought about education, whether it's early childhood education or school-age education, we've had an idea about how we need to deliver our services, and it looks like this. We fundamentally believe that we need first to teach kids skills, and then they will belong in the community. And at first glance, that seems to make common sense. You know, when you know more things, then you're better able to fit in. So essentially, teach those skills, and then you can belong. So in other words, what we see is that we need to create and foster ability before people have the opportunity. We've done that in schools, we've done that in adult programs, and we've done that in early childhood education. Learn the skills, and then you can belong. So ability comes first, followed by opportunity. Seems to make logical sense, doesn't it? So what we'd like to do is just challenge that idea a little bit. So what I would like you to do is take a couple of minutes and think of 4 classical musicians. Any 4. Got that? Okay. Now I want you to take a moment and think about 4 famous painters. Now, if you are like other audiences that we have asked this question of, you probably thought of people like Beethoven, Mozart, Brahms, Bach. And in terms of painters, maybe you thought about Picasso, Matisse, Renoir, and Van Gogh. And yes, it is Van Gogh. I'm Dutch. I know these things. And that's what most people say. When you look at these people, what do you notice? Well, again, if you're like other audiences that we've presented this to, and if you were here, maybe you would say it out loud, they're all men. And I might go on to add, they're all white men. So does that mean for the last 400 years, women and people of color have been completely devoid of artistic or musical ability? Of course it doesn't. What that tells us is that women and people of color were never allowed in. So in other words, they were never given the opportunity. So what we believe is that social convention, not ability, actually determines opportunity. Over to you.
So, as a counterpoint to what you've typically and possibly learned in all your education classes and your professors and instructors, we're going to suggest that we probably got it backwards. We believe that what we need to do, flip it around, is that you put people into the community with support, obviously, and that provides the precursor for that kid or person learning skills. So like I said, we've looked where the light is brightest, and where the light shines down is on ability and skills. What we're suggesting is the real answer may be away from the bright light. It may be around opportunity. So if you look at the traditional model with special education, I think it comes down to this. Segregated special education, or any type of segregation, fundamentally relies on working on ability first, believing that that will lead to opportunity. The fundamental difference in inclusive education lies not in simply putting kids in regular classes with other kids, but it's a recognition that when we do that, we're fostering opportunity that then leads to ability. And to illustrate this in a bit more detail, I want to talk about one of my favorite topics, me. And what I want to do is give you one example in my life where it was dead clear that opportunity had to come before ability. I was born in cerebral palsy. Neither the parents or the professionals had any idea of my cognitive ability. So when I was 4 years old, the question came up of which school I would go to. In Toronto, there were two distinct school districts. The public school district, which at that time had a new program, which was a school for kids with physical disabilities who could keep up with the regular curriculum. In Toronto, there was another completely separate school district that only provided segregated schools for kids with intellectual disabilities. So the question came out, which school would I go to? Which school district would I attend? And that came down to assessing my cognitive ability. So they brought a psychoeducational assessor in and gave me a standard test. Now, because of my limited ability to talk and my poor fine motor control, I simply couldn't do the puzzles or answer the questions that were being put to me. And in the end, the psychologist was marking down no response, no response, no response. And I was on a water slide in this school for kids with intellectual disabilities. And then she happened to show me the picture that looked like this. A picture of a voyageur scene with a canoe and there are people paddling. And like this picture, it was quite faded. And she asked, "Norman, what do you see here?" And I happened to say the word canoe, foggy. And the psychologist nearly fell off her chair because they the word canoe in terms of vocabulary was 2 or 3 levels higher than my age. And secondly, because I commented on the context of the photo, it showed that I was not only looking at the context, but the quality of the picture. At that point, the psychologist did something that possibly could have got her fired. She redid the test. And as all psychologists know, if you redo a test, that completely invalidates the results. But she did that, and she worked from the assumption that I had the intellectual ability to solve the problems, but lacked either the verbal ability to express it or the fine motor control to show what the answer was. So she did things like this. She would take a puzzle and put it half together and say, Norman, show me the piece that fits here. And my mother says I would bend down and touch the piece with my nose. I would get the piece right every time. Because I said the word canoe and foggy, and because that psychologist gave me the opportunity to redo the test, I went to a school that gave me a regular curriculum, but they gave me the opportunity to go to regular school. So they gave me the opportunity to go into an undergraduate and graduate degree. So the reason that I'm here is not because of an intellectual ability or ability to express myself. It's simply I got lucky. I happened to say the words canoe and foggy, and that radically changed the opportunities that I got. I want to tell you another story in my life where it was dead clear that opportunity had to come before ability. When I was in second grade school, twice a week for a half hour each time, I went to speech therapy. Now, for those of you who never have had speech therapy, what you do is you sit in a little room and read a book out loud. But you can't read the book in your ordinary voice. Nope. You have to read the book in your speech therapy voice. And when you speak in your speech therapy voice, you have to inhale, swallow, and articulate. And you have to do it in that order or else you'll choke yourself. And I would spend 30 minutes reading my book in my speech therapy voice. And then I would leave the speech therapy room and talk the way I usually talk, because everyone could understand me. Well, this went on for several years. And then when I wanted to go to regular school, my speech therapist said, Norm, you can't go to regular school. You made so much progress. If you quit speech therapy now, you may never get the opportunity to talk clearly. I said, yeah, but what's the good of being able to talk clearly if I have no friends to talk to? So I guess her advice, I went into regular school. And within 2 weeks I realized something. a lot of the kids and some of the students will listen to the first 4 or 5 words I would say. If they understood those first 4 or 5 words, they would keep listening. However, if they didn't understand those first words, they would presume my speech was unintelligible and try to fake it. I could always tell when people haven't understood me and try to fake it, because they always have the same 3 things. They smile, they nod, and they go, yeah. So I had to figure out a way that I could get the kids and the teachers to understand that they could understand me. So what I did is that when I first talked to someone, I would talk to them in my speech therapy voice. And once I convinced them that they could understand me, I would slowly seduce them into my usual way of talking. So I was doing this day in, day out. I was doing this in the lunchroom, walking home. And then I had to learn how to walk and talk at the same time. So after about a year of being in regular school, I started to meet family friends and relatives who hadn't seen me since I had left the segregated school. And over they came up to me and said, "Norman, what did you do? You're talking so much clearer now." And I would say, "I quit speech therapy." Now, I told that joke at a speech therapist conference in Sioux City, Iowa, and they didn't find that amusing. So, just in case there are any speech therapists in the room today, let me explain. What I learned in speech therapy was important. So don't worry, your life still has meaning. The point of that story is not that speech therapy wasn't important. The point was I needed to have the opportunity to be with other kids first, to then put the ability of what I had learned in speech therapy into practice. So that was an example when my skills really came into being when I had the opportunity first and then could develop the ability. So one of the ways Emma and I like to talk about this is we have a fundamental rule when it comes to segregation. And the rule goes like this: no matter how good of a swimming instructor you are, you cannot teach someone to swim in the parking lot of a swimming pool. And when we segregate kids, and when we focus on ability without opportunity, what we're doing in essence is we're trying to teach kids how to swim out of the environment of water. So when we look at putting disabled kids in regular settings, what we're doing is we're not simply being nice to disabled kids. What we're doing is they're putting them in a place where opportunities will foster skills, will foster ability. Now we'd like to give you another example of this relationship between ability and opportunity. And we'd like to introduce you to our friend and colleague Erin Sheldon and show you a short video in which we interviewed her about her daughter Maggie, who has Angelman syndrome. Although it seemed obvious that Maggie didn't have the cognitive or physical ability to use an iPad, they nonetheless bought an iPad for her, and both her family and the school personnel were blown away by what ability came out of Maggie's opportunity to use an iPad. Here's Erin Sheldon talking about that experience where opportunity truly led to new abilities.
When my daughter Maggie was in grade 2, so she's about 7, we were hearing all of these stories about kids who couldn't speak, who had all kinds of disabilities, who were using iPads to do all kinds of amazing things. So I was asking through school, could she have an iPad to use at school? And of course I didn't know what that meant. How would she use it? I had no idea. And neither did the school team. And they kind of assured me that she didn't have the prerequisite skills to be able to do anything with an iPad. She didn't have a pointer, that thing, anything like that. But we asked for her to have the technology anyway. Let's just see what would happen if she had this technology. We went out and bought it ourselves. We bought her an iPad. And I don't know what we were expecting, but 2 things happened. One, she developed the skills as soon as she had the opportunity. So she had never in her life been willing to point with her finger, but give her an iPad, and to open the screen you have to do that dragging motion, and she all of a sudden learned how to do, right, she learned how to isolate her finger and do all the things they wanted her to do because it was required. It was the only way she's going to be able to do anything with the iPad, as if she developed the skills. So she just needed the opportunity and the authentic purpose. But the other thing that happened was we weren't expecting all of the ways that she was immediately going to develop strategies around how to use the iPad to support her own biology. So Maggie's a kid who generally avoids direct eye contact, uses her peripheral vision a lot, and so she'll be watching something, but you won't necessarily be able to tell from looking at her how carefully she's looking. She has very sensitive hearing, and she has a way of just sort of turning off her hearing so that she doesn't get overwhelmed by what she hears. And so she'll appear to not be listening. And something happened when she got an iPad. And what we started noticing was, and what everyone started noticing, was that she just appeared to be much more aware and engaged. And she was doing things like, she just immediately realized that the camera could support her in doing so many things. So she might be sitting here, she might be sitting with a group of kids in school, and not appearing to be attending to what they were doing. But if you then watched what she was doing with the iPad, she was actually making a video of the kids. So she was recording it and then watching it and rewatching it and rewatching it. And we realized it was allowing her, the technology was allowing her to integrate her hearing and her vision in a way that's very difficult for her to do in real time. She tends to look or listen, but it's really difficult for her to do both together. And pretty much everything we do requires people to both look and listen at the same time. So she figured out on her own that the technology would allow her to look and then listen by simply rewinding her own videos. She has really significant visual challenges, and she realized on her own that the camera could support her own vision more than anything else ever had. So, for example, she can't really look across a room and see very much, and she certainly can't look across a room if it's very cluttered, if there's all kinds of stuff on the wall, if there's lots of stuff happening. She just can't organize her vision to take that in. So she tends to be a kid who's only looking at things within kind of arm's length. It's just overwhelming for her to look up across a busy room. So what she figured out was that she could use her iPad to aim it at whatever was happening that she wanted to be able to watch that was past kind of this realm, this sort of fingertips length that she can otherwise really engage in the world. And it was amazing to see how strategic she became, and realizing that she can't look across a room and see all of this, but she can use her iPad to aim it and make a frame that she can look at, and she can bring the world within arm's length to her to see what she wants to do.
So it sounds like that one of the common presumptions among teachers and clinicians and their general in society in general is that if a person cannot communicate, it is often assumed that they have a cognitive disability.
I would say that's exactly it. So she doesn't speak, but she also, when you talk to her, she doesn't in that immediate moment she doesn't necessarily follow up on what you just said, right? There isn't an immediate recognition that she understands what you said, and therefore there's even more presumption of severe intellectual disability, because of course, that would be the only reason that someone wouldn't appear to understand what you just said to them. And I think what we saw that was the most revolutionary once Maggie had her iPad and was recording everything was maybe it wasn't intellectual disability, maybe it's auditory processing. And she can't hear and process what she hears at the same time she's also trying to process what she sees. And so if we can give her technology that allows her to review things over and over, look and then listen, and take away some of the real-time demands of, hi, how are you? You have to immediately respond. If we take away some of that real-time demands, then we immediately see, oh, she actually can understand. But she needed technology that made speech accessible. I think for what I see with Maggie is that speech is very fleeting. You say it and it's gone. As soon as you say the word, it's gone. And so if you have difficulty processing the sound of speech, I think we all just sound like wah, 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 wah. But that doesn't mean that it's an intellectual impairment. It's a neurological and it's an auditory impairment, and it just needs accommodation. And Maggie was the one who figured out on her own that simply being able to carry a video camera around and record everything gave her the opportunity to process what she hears and process what she sees at her own speed on her own time. And part of it is because she doesn't speak, the camera, you have this big iPad screen that she's carrying around. As people see her watching videos, as they see her watching a video of the conversation they just had, it's a window for the rest of the world into what she's thinking about. So people see her, we're having this conversation, she's recording us, and then we watch her watching it over and over again. And we go, whoa, she was really paying attention. She was listening. Look at her. She's interested in what we were saying in a way that she couldn't show us that before. It wasn't evident before.
I can hear clinicians say, well, that's great for Maggie. In the world of scholastic language, we call that anecdotal. To what degree do you think what you've learned with Maggie can be generalized to other people with autism or related conditions?
Well, we're already seeing it. I was just messaging with a woman named Linda Burkhardt, who's a special educator who works on communication with the same population. And she had been listening to all of my stories about Maggie and started seeing if video would make the same difference with her students, and found, again, those students who struggle the most with auditory comprehension and vision together, as soon as we put things in a video format and give them control over when they get to review it, what they're recording, that kind of stuff, that she was seeing the same thing. And I think these are the students who are most likely to presume have the most severe intellectual impairment, and therefore the least likely to give them some form of assistive technology. What I see the most is teachers say, oh, this student loves video, and so we're using video as the reinforcer and the motivator. You do everything I tell you to do, and then you get to have video at the end. And so the conversation I have the most with special educators is, let's make the instruction in video. Let's take away some of the real-time demands. I think, so what I see with students, for example, with autism, where having this conversation back and forth, the demands of joint attention can be so demanding that there's not a lot left over to be able to do the things we're asking them to do. So let's take away the demand for joint attention by putting the whole thing into video format so that they don't have to attend to you and something else at the same time. We can actually put it in video. I also think one of the things that really helps many kids is now they're not hearing sounds from a whole bunch of different places. I don't have to figure out where you are and your voice is coming and she is and her voice is coming from, and now there's something else. But I'm organizing all the sounds in one place. And that just seems to make a huge difference for certain students who just really struggle to process what they're hearing. And what we're doing to so many of our students is we're saying, now look at me, until you look at me, I can't tell you the next thing. Now listen to me, show you're listening to me, and as soon as you prove to me you're listening, now I'll give you the next step. Well, some of our kids will never look and will never listen. And so we're assuming that, or never appear to, they'll never give us that bone that we're asking them for. I want direct eye contact and I want you nodding your head. And now I'll move to the next step. And so we're never moving to the next step with those kids. And what we're seeing with the iPads is we're able to say, ignore the looking at me. Ignore the listening to me. Let's skip that step and let's just move right into whatever the next task is and see if I actually take away the demand of look at me and listen to me. Can you actually do the work, the cognitive engagement that I want? Because really, the cognitive engagement is not the looking at me, the eye contact is not cognitive engagement, the task is. And what the video format with the iPad is allowing us to do is kind of move to that next step. So like I saw, for example, I think Maggie was in grade 4, and her class was studying pointillism in art. And so all of the students had coloring pencils and they were doing this pointillism. And her teacher wanted Maggie to take bingo dabbers because she can grasp a bingo dabber and do pointillism with bingo dabbers. So she's trying to show Maggie, look Maggie, you can do this. You can hold this and you can put the bingo dabber here. And Maggie's just like that, right? She's not watching. And we said, that's okay. That's okay. Don't wait for her to watch. Let's just videotape it. We're just going to video it on her iPad and we're going to see what happens. So the teacher went ahead with the lesson as though Maggie was watching. And you could tell this was a leap of faith for her, right? What's the point of this? Maggie watched the video over and over again. And that night, on her own, finds a big box of bingo dabbers she has and pointillized our entire dining room table. So she needed processing time, right? She needed to be able to look at what she was being asked to do and have her own time at her own pace, figure out how she was going to implement it. It was an 8-hour gap. Our teachers aren't trained to think that that's okay. They're trained to, if you don't give me a response in about 5 seconds, I'm going to assume you didn't understand and you can't do it or you're being non-compliant. The idea of giving a kid 8 hours to respond to something we ask them to do is really revolutionary, but it's been really exciting. Well, and it was interesting because even our school board assistive technology person was watching Maggie on the iPad and said, can you believe that we thought she had severe intellectual disability? Because look at her now. And I was just like, she hasn't been cured of her severe intellectual disability. We weren't supporting her. Her environment was not giving her the supports that she needed to show us what she knew. Maggie hasn't changed. We've changed. We've provided new technology. We've provided new opportunities. Maggie's the same kid. She has the same impairments she had before, right? She has the same disabilities. We're just recognizing her strategies and we're just better supporting her. And I hate it when I get these comments about how Maggie's changed so much, Maggie's learned so much. I'm not so sure. I think she's always been doing these things and we're now recognizing them and we're now doing a much better job supporting her.
So let me just push this a little bit further. I'd like to put the question out to you. Is it normal for people to have disabilities? Now, most of you probably don't politically correctly decide to say, yes, disability is part of diversity. But I want to push that a bit further. When you think of a person with a disability, usually what most of us believe is that people shouldn't have disabilities. Now, you may be in favor of inclusion, accessibility, disability rights, but you believe when people have a disability, that wasn't the way they were meant to be. So in my case, you might say, Norman, I fully agree with, you have the right to go to a regular school, and etc. But underneath that, there's a perception that when you were born, something went wrong, so you are not the way you should have been. So when you believe that people should have disabilities, then when you put a ramp in place, what you do is you see that ramp as something to accommodate my mobility impairment. You're doing something for me, and you're locating the disability in my body. Again, you may be fully committed to the idea of ramps being provided, but something being done for me. What happens if we change that initial presumption? What if we begin with the idea that it is inevitable that some people will be disabled? Accidents happen, there are sicknesses, etc. And no matter how much research or medical advancement occurs, there will always be people who have disabilities. As we get older, most of us get disabilities because our bodies break down. So if we understand that disability is an inherent part of the human condition, that changes our understanding of accommodation. Because now when we build a ramp, we're not doing something to accommodate the deficiency in that person. We're correcting an architectural error. We're correcting the idea that this building was built on the premise that only non-disabled people would use it. And we're correcting that presumption. Now, this doesn't only apply to physical accommodations. This also applies to kids and students who have cognitive disabilities or learning disabilities. We've built schools and educational programs on the idea that all kids will be normal, that no kids will have learning or cognitive disabilities. So whether it's a ramp, universal design, accommodation to learning, what we're doing is we're not meeting the deficiency of the individual, we're correcting the error in our school system that believes that people shouldn't have disabilities. So one way of understanding this process is it's relocating the problem of disabilities. The wave and thought of the prevailing narrative in our society is that disability is something within me, whereas we start to have to realize that disability is out there in the world. So the problem of disability is not located in me. The problem of disability is a societal problem. It's a pervasive belief that people shouldn't have disabilities. And because of this, disabled people are not given the opportunity to learn the skills and develop in society like non-disabled people.
What I'd like to do now is add a little more complexity to this discussion. Norm talked a lot about opportunity, and of course that's really important, but what I would like to suggest is that opportunity is not enough. Now, in order to unpack that, I want to tell you a couple of stories, and I'm going to start with doing my introduction. And what I'd like to do is start by giving you what I like to call my official story, and I'll bet you have one too. We all do. So this is my official story. This is the story we tell when we're introduced at keynotes or when we go to a cocktail party and someone asks, "So what do you do? Tell me about yourself." We all have those stories. Mine goes like this. I started working in community living agencies for people with intellectual disabilities when I was still a teenager. Later, I worked as a preschool teacher and I studied psychology in college. I eventually returned to the community living field and worked in group homes, supported employment, and gradually moved to supervisory roles, managing employment programs, supported preschools and infant development programs, and then finally, I actually became a labor relations specialist and trainer, much to my surprise. When Norm and I met almost 30 years ago, he convinced me to quit the day job and come out on the road with him as a trainer and a speaker. So that's what I've been doing for the last almost 30 years, I guess. During that time, I became certified as a negotiator and a mediator with the Justice Institute of British Columbia, and I worked as a coach and a trainer there for almost 7 years. Then 10 years ago, I went back to school and received a master's degree in conflict management and analysis. Yeah, so that's the official story. Now I want to introduce you to what I like to call my unofficial story. So this is little me, as you can see in these pictures, and little me is the one that looks light sensitive and is always kind of standing a little ways back from everybody, or playing in water, etc. I was, by my own admission, an unusual and intense child. I experienced significant sensory overload, though nobody really used those words at the time. I experienced touch sensitivity, sound sensitivity, sensitivity to smells and tastes, and I needed an inordinate amount of downtime. Lucky for me, although my parents were often bemused and sometimes irritated and certainly exhausted by my intensity, they never tried to change me or tell me that my way of being in the world was wrong. They gave me space to follow my bliss. And indeed, they often facilitated whatever currently engaged my attention. I was allowed to retreat to my room or outside into the forest close to where we lived, free to engage in my many passionate interests, reading, drawing, lining up my farm animals and dolls endlessly. They also saw that water was and still is an important way for me to self-regulate, though nobody used those words in those days either. And they tried to facilitate this in a lot of ways. I was allowed to take long baths and trips to the river, the lake, or the pool. My mother used to joke that she'd finally have to pull me out of the water when I turned blue. In short, my early life at home was happy and supported. But now let's delve a little bit further and talk about my time at school. So it all changed when I entered school. For me, school was an unmitigated nightmare. The characteristics that really just simply bemused and yes, sometimes irritated my family were transformed immediately by educators into personal failings. I became the sad recipient of a lot of adult frustration. My teachers figured that I was pretty smart and that I likely had all the necessary ability to succeed, but they had no idea how to help. Instead, the problems they saw were viewed as something I did on purpose. The labels I collected were not medicalized. Instead, they were descriptions of volitional behavior: lazy, non-compliant, obsessive. So quirkiness was transformed into moral failings. So must try harder, doesn't pay attention, and a variety of other things were part of a constant litany that followed me from my earliest academic experiences. You know, I don't entirely blame educators for this. I was certainly a child who presented really baffling dichotomies. After all, how is an educator to understand a hyperlexic child who's reading in 2 languages by the age of 3 and reading existentialist literature at age 12, but is inexplicably dyscalculic and can't even master the times tables or the simplest mathematical equation? I was seen as inattentive, non-compliant, and ultimately disruptive. I was frustrating to my teachers. I was single-tracked, focused on something and then stuck on that track, often at the expense of getting anything else done. And paradoxically, I was really easily distracted and experienced a real difficulty getting my brain's motivational apparatus in gear if the topic didn't engage me. Do I sound familiar to you, like any of the kids you know? Norm often jokes today that I'm the proverbial light switch. I'm either on or off, there's no in between. So my idiosyncratic and divergent learning style made conventional classroom approaches almost completely inaccessible to me. And my love-hate relationship with the spatial world made physical education an impossible enterprise. This continued until the day that I quit school in demoralized desperation at the age of 15. So I went on actually internalizing and believing those things about myself that I had been told were moral failings. Internalized ableism is a thing, right? I think Hilda Lindemann Nelson calls it doxastic damage, when you take in what other people say about you and you incorporate it into your self-image. It wasn't until later that things began to change for me. And those things changed when Norm and I started a doctoral program. We were looking at therapies, compliance-based therapies and physical therapy, and wondering about what kind of an effect those had on children, and whether sometimes the results of those therapies were unintended, and that sometimes kids would adopt a view of themselves as a result of therapy that they were broken and in need of fixing. So I started reading the work of autistic women and non-binary people. And that was incredibly important for me. So one of the books that I really loved was Nerdy, Shy, and Socially Inappropriate by Cynthia Kim. And I would be reading that book and the hair would stand up on the back of my neck. And I would bring it over to Norm and I'd say, look at this. And he'd say, that sounds just like you. And I started reading other things. So I was reading blogs, and I got connected with the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network. And one of the blogs I particularly loved was the Autistic Hoya by Lydia Brown, and many, many, many others. And I began to see myself reflected there. And ultimately, I began to realize that it wasn't a moral failing, that I was actually an undiagnosed autistic child. And this is harder for girls. I think you probably all know that, because girls tend to fly under the radar, right? We don't get diagnosed as often because we often have different sets of social skills that make us not look the same as the quintessential 8-year-old boy with autism. And, that's something that in autistic circles we laugh about. We say, if you don't look like an 8-year-old boy and line up your toys and have meltdowns in the grocery store and love trains, then you couldn't possibly be autistic. Well, I did line up my toys, and I do love trains. But in any event, I didn't recognize myself, even though I had been working with disabled people my entire adult life, and even some time before that. I didn't recognize myself until I started reading what other autistic women and non-binary people were saying about their experiences. And I saw myself reflected there. And that was a very important moment. So because I was undiagnosed and largely flew under the radar, my experience was different from Norm's. I was never denied access to the classroom. It was never suggested to me that segregation was appropriate or that I should take part in any remedial programs. In fact, there weren't any remedial programs in the schools I attended. Arguably, I had experienced all the opportunity I could wish for, but the problem was I lacked support. Because nobody understood that I was experiencing the classroom and, in fact, the world differently and coping with a laundry list of sensory and learning issues, I was largely ignored or treated with disdain and frustration. It's undeniably true that opportunity must precede ability, but unfortunately, opportunity without support is a setup for failure. So my experience was best encapsulated by the immortal words of Pogo. If any of you are old enough to remember Pogo, I was surrounded by insurmountable opportunity. So opportunity is not enough. So in Norm's early years, he was stuck in the parking lot. He talked about that earlier. And teachers with the best of intentions could not possibly replicate the nuances of typical experiences that he needed to know about through some fabricated life skills education. It was only after leaving the segregated school and being out in the community that he was able to learn the more complex issues of human interaction and the skills he'd need to be successful. Now me, I wasn't in the parking lot. I was in the pool, but I spent most of my time drowning. I'm sometimes asked when it comes to support what would have been most helpful for me as a child. And it's not an easy question to answer, but probably the most important thing is listening. Now, listening can be really tricky with young children, as we know, because they don't always bring issues to you in ways that are easy to understand. However, listening, empathy, and also the suspension of judgment. One of the things that we often say about behavior is that behavior is communication. And
I would agree. Most behavior is communication of one sort or another, but sometimes there are other things going on. In order to illustrate this for you, we want to play you a video of our dear friend and colleague, Pat Amos, talking about a situation that happened for her daughter in 2nd grade. I think it illustrates the importance of listening, the importance of involving the student in whatever it is that's going to happen for them, and the importance of respecting how people show up in the world.
There was a second experience I then had with my daughter a little later, and I think that was another big turning point in my life. She also wound up with a similar diagnosis on the autism spectrum, and when she was in 2nd grade, we were having a difficult time with getting her school services, getting things right, getting people to understand her and her to understand them. And one of the things that she started to do in her 2nd grade class was to just get up and leave. So it surprised me the way in which people reacted to this, because they really acted as if they were afraid of her. So what would happen is she'd just all of a sudden jump up and she'd run out of the room all upset, and she'd run down the hallway, and then the teacher would run after her to stop her, to grab her and bring her back. But she was very, very quicker than the teacher. So then the assistant principal would come and follow the teacher, and then the principal would follow the assistant principal, and then the janitor would follow, and they'd all be this long procession running through the halls of the school. And she would head unerringly to the cafeteria, because there were those great big long tables. And as a little tiny person, she only had to duck a little bit to get under them. And she could then spend hours shifting from table to table to table while the big adults came in and tried to grab her and run after her. And eventually, of course, someone would corner her, and someone would get a hold on her, and they'd haul her out, hold her up, and she'd be, dirty and tear-stained and upset. And at that point, they would call me to come to the school. And they'd just kind of say, "Is this yours, Did you leave this here? Want to come and claim it?" And I would take her home and clean her up. And of course, this led to, behavior analyses being done and a behavioral assessment. They didn't call it that in those days. But a team had to come and meet with her and diagnose her and so forth. And among the team's recommendations were that maybe she needed to be in a special segregated school, that, we really just couldn't be doing this every day. So when I tell this story, I always ask people, especially if they're teachers or teachers in training, what would you typically do when a child like this would leave the room? Why do you think the child would be leaving the room? And first of all, they'll tell me 2 things. That the child is leaving the room to get attention, that all of this activity is about attention, and I will point out to them that, in fact, she seemed to be crying. She seemed to be upset. And then they'll tell me that bad attention for kids like these is the same as good attention. They want either kind, and either kind is motivating. So that fits into this little system that they've been taught. And this fits a belief system. And then the second thing they'll tell me is that she's avoiding task. By leaving the classroom, she's not having to do the work. And so it must be task avoidance and attention-seeking behavior. So then I will ask them, what would you typically do in a classroom? And what we get are these reward systems, point and level systems, that every 15 minutes they would give her a star if she stays in her desk in the classroom, and she gets a certain number of stars, she'll get a reward. So they've got various kinds of elaborate systems of rewards and consequences that they thought they could implement to keep her in the classroom. And my theory was that this was not going to work. This is what the school had, in fact, wanted to do. And we sat down and we had a little meeting. And first of all, I said to the teachers, call her in. Ask her. So, we never ask. We just have meetings about people, but we don't have meetings with people. And I don't care if it's only 2nd grade. Ask her. So they called her into the room and said, "Well, honey, why do you get up and run?" She says, "My brain doesn't tell my legs what to do. My legs tell my brain what to do." She knew. It was a perfect example of motor-driven behavior, and she was telling them it's not under my control. So then the question still was, they still wanted to do the point system and the reward system so that she could learn self-control. And we had a long discussion about how do people learn self-control? How do they get the personal, emotional, social space to learn something? And we asked them to do something very daring that had never apparently been done before in the history of the earth. And that was to let her leave the room, to simply write up a system whereby when she wanted to, when she felt she needed to, when her anxiety was so great that she needed to go, she should just do what we would do for our own selves. We would go. And no one would ask her, no one would remark on it, would draw any attention whatsoever, and she would be told, you can go see the school nurse, the school secretary, or the school librarian, 3 fine, upstanding women who will give her a book to read and something to do, and when she's calm and she's ready, she'd go back to the classroom. But also when she went back, the teacher was not to say anything, no one was to draw any attention, this would go unremarked. Well, of course, the initial objections were all about the domino effect. If she gets to do it, everyone will want to do it too. You know, you have to give kids credit. Kids have much more sense than that. Everyone's not going to want to jump up and go. And kids are also very understanding that different people need different things. They have a lot more common sense than we tend to give them credit for. So we said, look, just try it. So she comes back into the room and we say, look, we figured out what we can do. With your consent, you want to do this, this is what your new system will be. If you need to leave the room, you're just going to leave. And this is where you can go and this is what you do. Do you understand that? She goes, mm-hmm. So she goes back to the classroom and the system is now in place. We would definitely expect to see improvement and we'd expect to see it somewhat gradual. But in her case, this was so powerful, it was so effective that she never needed to leave her seat again. And people were just astonished. But of course the answer was that this was anxiety-driven behavior. And once she was given control and the power to sort of play around with how her body felt, she was learning about her body. She was learning how it worked, and she was doing that in an environment where she was not afraid. So she could sit there and say, I feel like I gotta leave, gotta leave, I gotta leave, gotta leave. Oh wait, I can leave. Okay then, I'll give it another 5 minutes. And she was learning to do that very, very effectively. So we had given her the power. If there's anything going on there that we can talk about that's valid, it's about a lot of anxiety and some issues about needing to be in control. I think our kids, and a lot of kids, whether they have a label or not, feel like they're not in control of their destiny. And the anxiety gets so high that they can't function at all. And I think what we need to be doing is not taking power and control away from them and husbanding it to ourselves, but giving it to them. And I think that's the essence of good pedagogy. It's good education, it's good learning, and it's probably the last thing that we think of to do. And so then autism then becomes another repository in our society of what we do when we have bad pedagogy and bad educational practices, where we're always taking power and control away from people and never finding a way to give it to them.
So sometimes the way in which kids will tell us things don't come neatly packaged, and we actually have to play detective and decode them, and I think you know that. One story that I like came from a friend of ours who was an itinerant teacher, art teacher, and she was working with a little boy one day who drew a disturbing picture. He drew a picture of a house, and he used a lot of black wax crayon, and out of the chimney of the house there was a lot of black smoke in that very, very thick, dark crayon. And there was a little figure, little stick figure also coming out. And Susan said, "What's that?" And he said, "My dad just blew up." Now, I think for a lot of us that would ring alarm bells, right? And it did for Susan and for the teacher. So they went and they did a little digging, and they found out that in fact it was not abuse. The father had left the home very recently, and that was his way of showing what he felt about that. So we sometimes have to find unusual ways to listen to kids, different ways. So the next thing, and this is I've borrowed from our friend Nick Walker, who is also autistic and a professor down there in California where you are. And Nick says, trust the weirdness. He says, you know, there's so much remediation going on for little kids. Parents feel like they have to do it. People feel like they have to do it in preschools, in schools, etc. Like weed out that weirdness. And he says, you know, that's a mistake, because that, again, in that same way of doxastic damage, it can implant an identity of deficiency in a child. He says, let kids play around with figuring out how their bodies and brains work. That's what worked best for me with my parents. They did that. They didn't try to change me or fix me. They just kind of went, okay, let's support what she wants to do in whatever way she wants to do it. Does that mean I didn't need to learn some things, gain some social skills? No, of course those things would have been helpful, but context is everything, and how that happens is really, really critical. The next thing would have been acknowledgement. People sometimes ask me, well, would it have helped you to know that you were autistic as a kid? In some ways, I think it would have. It really would have, because then I would not have internalized all those negative things about myself. I would have been able to say, no, this is just a different way of being in the world. But here's the rub. What I see happening a lot for little kids nowadays is that they get immersed into compliance-based therapies at a very, very early age. And what I know from my adult friends who are now young women, men, non-binary people who have been through those compliance-based, through that kind of compliance-based therapy, is that many of them are experiencing post-traumatic stress disorder as a result of it. And I think we have to think about what happens when we encourage kids to not use the ways they have to self-regulate and to cope with the world. So telling a kid to have quiet hands can be really quite damaging. And all of the ridiculous things that we sometimes ask children to do. Julia Bascom, who's the executive director of the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network, said that when she was little, they used to glue her hands to the table. I don't think people do stuff like that anymore, at least I would really hope they don't. But at the same time, you know, hand flapping, spinning, all of those things that we use to kind of manage our sensory world are often things that people try to eradicate. So I'm glad I didn't experience that, because I see the effects on adult people and I hear what they're saying. The next thing is presuming that students, when they're disruptive, are struggling. They're not being resistant. One of the things about autism that often frustrates teachers and others is that it seems like one day a child will know how to do something and then the next day they won't. Only that's often interpreted as, well, you did it yesterday. Are you just being difficult or obtuse? No, this is really a common thing for a lot of kids with different learning disabilities, including autism. So presume that students are struggling and not resistant. When it comes to rethinking disruption, I always like to think of the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr., who once said, "A riot is the language of the unheard." And I think that's just as true for kids as for adults. So our friend and colleague Bill Page also uses a swimming analogy. He says, never give swimming lessons when someone is drowning. So just being in the pool isn't enough either. Opportunity has to be accompanied by support. And sometimes that support is about fostering learning, but sometimes it's simply about providing safety. Bill reminds us that educators and parents have two roles. He says that of the swimming instructor and that of the lifeguard. He suggests that we get into trouble when we don't understand which role we need to assume at which time. When I was drowning, it was not helpful for the teacher to be a swimming instructor, yelling directions from the metaphorical pool deck. What I needed was someone who was a lifeguard, someone to get into the pool with me and help me get to shallow water. And then later, after the overwhelm had dissipated and I was ready to engage, then to help me learn the skills that I needed. I did my master's thesis about 10 years ago, and I did it on de-escalation because the whole issue of disruption has always been very, very interesting to me, partly because I was a disruptive kid, but also because I've worked with a lot of people who protest their lives through disruption. And so what I did was I went sideways, and I decided that I was going to interview people who dealt with the most difficult situations that we could imagine. So I went to hostage negotiators, and I interviewed hostage negotiators all over North America about the relational and communication-based approaches that they use to help very, very upset people de-escalate. It was a fascinating year of research. Eventually, I took this thesis and turned it into a book, and that's a commercial, just in case you're wondering. But it really made me think about how we see people who are disruptive. And one of the things I learned from the hostage negotiators that I think was the most important thing was that they changed the way they saw people. They changed the narrative that they held about who the person who was being disruptive actually was. So you and I might look at a hostage situation and say, who's that jerk in the bank with a sawed-off shotgun and 3 hostages? And we'd say, there's no way you can be relational and communication-based with a person doing that. And if you're like me, you probably saw negotiation through the lens of television, which tells you that it's all about SWAT team and smoke bombs and throw phones and all of that stuff. What I learned from negotiators is that actually it all had to do with communication. And the first thing that a negotiator will say when they come on the scene of a hostage taking or a suicide attempt is, so how do we get here today? And then they get genuinely curious. And they change the narrative. Over and over and over, they told me, you cannot let judgment creep in when you're thinking about a person. What you have to do instead is change the way you see that person to just a person in a bad place, and start there. Because if you let your judgments in, they said, it leaks into the conversation. And they told me stories about negotiations that had derailed because somebody had let judgment creep in. So that I found very, very interesting. And the way that I began to posit it was like this. So one narrative, and a typical narrative when we have a disruptive student, is smarten up. And that is a narrative of correction. But negotiators would never do that. Instead, they say, what's up? And that's a narrative of curiosity. Other people like Ross Greene, you may have read Ross Greene's book, The Explosive Child or Lost at School. He talks about this question too. And we think it's a really important question to ask. What's up? I want to tell you a little story. This is a story that happened to us when we were working for a school district a few years back. One of the things that Norm sometimes does is school assemblies. And in this instance, we were doing a school assembly and a presentation and then a parent and community presentation in the evening. So Norm did his usual assembly presentation to these, 2nd through 5th grade kids, I guess. And it was great. It went well. And as we were leaving the auditorium, we were walking down the hall with the principal. And there was a little boy, really maybe 5, 6, something like. And he's walking down the hall with a teacher. And the principal says, Jorge, come over here for a minute. She says, I want you to meet Mr. Norman. And so she says, now, you just heard Mr. Norman talk. And, you haven't been doing very well at school at all, have you? And he his head is down and he nods, says, yeah. And she says, now you saw that Mr. Norman has been through some difficult things and you see where he's gone. Now, that wasn't exactly the message Norm was trying to make, but anyway. So Norm and I think Jorge, were feeling a little uncomfortable, but she carried on and she said, now you can do better, right? And Jorge nodded with his head down, yes, I can do better. So off he went. We then went to the library where we were doing a presentation with teachers. And I presented the material from my thesis and talked about the difference between a narrative of smarten up and what's up. And then a few hours later, we came back into the library where the community presentation was being set up. And the principal came rushing in and she was crying. And I thought, uh-oh, this can't be good. And so she said, no, it's okay. I thought about what you said, and I went and found Jorge. And she said, I sat him down, and I said, so Jorge, what's up? And she said, and he told me. He said that his parents had split up a few weeks ago, and last week his mom came back and told the kids that she was going away forever and she would not be seeing them anymore. He says, now I just sit in my seat and I look at the wall and think about how I'm not going to see my mommy. And she said, I thought I was doing really good work with kids and that I was asking them. But she says, I wasn't really asking the right questions. And sometimes I wasn't asking any questions at all. I was just telling them how to, straighten up and fly right. And she said, but hey, it gets better. She says, one of my teachers came in and she'd been struggling with this student all year. And she was so frustrated. She came into my office and I said to her, look, just go down there, get the student, sit down and ask him what's up. About 20 minutes later, the teacher came back and she was crying. And she said, this kid told me about his life, about how his father picks him up by the ear and throws him around, and what happens out in his neighborhood. And she said, you know, he's growing up in the neighborhood I grew up in. He's living my life. So again, the principal said, you know, there's such power in that question, what's up? And it's a question I think we always need to start with, like the hostage negotiators. So how do we get here today? And then just listen. Kids need that more than anything, right? I think we know that. I think the lights had also gone on for me a number of years ago when I first started training as a mediator. I'd been working in human service organizations where we were expected to have the answers to everything. We didn't always, but we were expected to. And when I started training as a mediator, I was surprised and delighted to find that I was not expected to have any answers at all. In fact, what I needed most was questions. And that's what you do in mediation, right? You learn how to ask questions. And the thing that, you know, people talked about powerful questions, and at first I was really intimidated by that. Like, what's a powerful question? But I learned about that too, that those are often the short and easy questions. Once heard Larry King interviewed by a radio personality here in Canada after he'd written his book. And the interviewer said, you know, your friends in this book say that you ask really dumb questions. What do you make of that? And Larry King says, yeah, I do. He says, it's true, because when I started out in my career as an interviewer, I used to hear other interviewers ask a question on TV and then spend the next 10 minutes giving their opinion. And then when there were about 2 minutes left in the program, they would ask the guest for their opinion. He said, I vowed I would never be like that. And he says, you know, so now I just sit there and I say things like, so what happened then? And what happened after that? Really? And he says, and people tell me stuff. So in my mind, one of the best examples of a powerful question is, what's up? Or how'd we get here today? But the point after that is to just sit and listen. So in our book, at the risk of being solipsistic or doing another commercial, this is what we've said. Although improving ability may make a person's life easier in some respects, it probably won't make their life better. The significant obstacles confronting us are the lack of opportunities, not the limitations of ability. And in that context, we also need to think about the kind of support we offer in order to ensure that people leave school, preschool, whatever kind of school, with a sense of confidence, competence, and optimism. So to summarize then, as disabled people, we believe that it is both essential and ethical that disabled kids are offered the same opportunity as their non-disabled peers. Focusing on ability to the exclusion of opportunity is not only fundamentally unjust, it ironically undermines the very conditions needed to acquire those abilities. And yet, it is equally important that those opportunities be accompanied by support, and that educators take the time to work with the student to determine what kind of support will be most helpful. So going back to that slide that we put up at the very beginning, we believe that it's important not to fall into the trap of looking for those keys where the light is best. And sometimes the place where we need to go to look for those keys is with the individual themselves, to ask the kid, ask the family, and connect with them. So where are you looking? Where are you looking for those keys? So I want to close with a little story that comes from the Lakota Sioux. And the story goes like this. An elder brought his tribe together one day, and he said, inside of us there are two dogs, and they're always fighting. The two dogs are mean and happy. And he asked the members of his tribe, which dog do you think will win? And he suggested that they go away, think about it, and talk about it, and that they should come back the next day and they could discuss. So the next day, members of his group came back, and some of them said that happy would win, and others said, nah, you're being naive. Mean will always win. And the elder said, you're both wrong. The dog that will win is the dog that you feed the most. So we like to conceptualize these two dogs as ability and opportunity, and ask ourselves, which dog are we going to focus on? Which dog are we going to feed? Are we going to focus strictly on ability with the belief that that ability will translate later into opportunity? Or are we going to start with opportunity and let ability come from there?
So to conclude, what we'd like to do is offer you some key points to remember some of the ideas that we offered to you throughout this presentation. So, firstly, ability doesn't precede opportunity. Opportunity precedes ability. Social convention, not ability, determines opportunity. Remember, I learned to speak clearly when I quit speech therapy. You can't teach someone to swim in the parking lot of a swimming pool.
And remember, opportunity is not enough. Support is also needed. And never give swimming lessons when someone is drowning. Remember that questions are more important than answers. And don't forget to ask what's up rather than demanding that a person smarten up. Innovation delivers what rehabilitation promises. And finally, ask yourself, which dog do we feed? Do we focus on ability or do we focus on opportunity? Both are important, but opportunity needs to come before ability. So we'll sign off, and we really hope this has been useful for you. So good luck.
And stay safe. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Hi, guys.
Hi.
So,
I'll need my glasses.
Yeah. We have some questions, so do you want to read the first one, Emma?
All right. We should use the children's proper name they are given, unless a nickname. Use diverse examples, be a positive example, as we teachers are the example. Now, there's not really a question in here, but maybe we can just comment.
No, why don't you start? When we say proper name, I'm not sure what they mean.
Yeah, I'm not entirely sure either. But if you're referring to talking about a child as a person, as opposed to a diagnosis, and opposed to anything else, then absolutely.
And can I just add, and my problem is I'm trying to guess at the question behind this statement. I get the person who said this making a statement, but there's a question underneath.
Yeah.
I'm getting a sense of that question. I may be wrong, but here's my guess. If we're talking about disabled kid, because in our societies, disability is so stigmatized, we often feel that if we say the kid's name, we're stigmatizing the kid. And I guess what we believe is that children have the right to be disabled. As you saw in the keynote, disability is a part of diversity. And so there's no shame in being disabled. So the more matter of fact we can be in talking about disability.
And talking with the child.
Yeah.
Okay, let's move on to the next one. How can we apply inclusion in the classroom? Well, that is a very, very big question that has multifaceted answers. Do you want to have a go at that?
Yeah, we tried to talk about that in the keynote in terms of inclusion is not do this, do this, do this. It's coming from a perspective, and the best way up to now that we've had this perspective, it's looking at giving kids opportunity rather than focusing on ability. So that's the first issue. Like we said in our presentation, you've been trained in trying to make me or other disabled people as less disabled as they can be. And what we're saying is, no, you have to resist what you've been taught and give people opportunities. And the second thing, do you want to talk about what's up versus smart now?
Well, I guess one of the things that we're both passionate about, and me in particular, is the whole issue of behavior and how behavior gets seen in the classroom. And like people like Ross Green, we really believe that a better question or a better response to people when they're struggling, rather than saying, smarten up, is to ask, what's up?
Like in the keynote.
Yeah. So shall we?
Yeah.
Okay. Do you believe over the years, students have been misdiagnosed with the stage and the disability category? Let me respond to that one. Yeah, I do, especially as a woman who only came to understand her autism much later in life. I know that I have been misdiagnosed, and that the unfortunate consequences of that misdiagnosis for me was that everything that I did was regarded as a moral failing rather than a consequence of what I was dealing with and what I was struggling with. I know for many of my autistic sisters and brothers and non-binary folks, what happens often for them is that those misdiagnoses can be even more dire. So they get diagnoses that get them put in mental hospitals, that have them on psychotropic drugs, all in the name of trying to understand what's going on and absolutely missing it. Especially for girls and women, I think we, again, as we mentioned earlier, fly under the radar. And so oftentimes we're not understood as struggling. And I really struggled in the classroom a lot with a sensory overload, with a laundry list of things that were going on. And I don't blame educators for not understanding it, but I also understand the consequences of it.
Let me add to that. One of the things I know as a disabled person is that if a non-disabled person screws up in the classroom, they go, oh, they had a bad day. If a disabled person screws up in a classroom or has a meltdown or just has a bad day, suddenly that one incident is attributed to some inherent attribute in the person
Of the disability.
And as one black activist said, if a white man falls off a bar stool, it's a white man falling off a bar stool. But if a black man falls off a bar stool, it's the entire black race falling off a bar stool. So I think in terms of misdiagnosis, as a disabled person, I was so aware of trying to walk that thin, tight line because I knew any mistake would give some people, not all people, but some people in the administration, the rationale to exclude me, to move me into a different school. So when you're disabled, you have to be absolutely perfect, I have to exclude it. Whereas if you're non-disabled and white,
Well, one of the things we've often talked about is that we tend to cut people more slack. Oftentimes cut, like if you think about your friends and your friends do something that's really, they miss an appointment or they have a little bit of a meltdown, we're inclined to just cut them a little slack. We're less inclined to do that with disabled kids because we tend to see them as 9/10 disability, as we talked about earlier.
right,
So now we need to click.
Scroll down.
Yeah.
Hold on. That's my job. Uh-oh. Fine motor control.
Could it be my job?
Fine motor control under
There you
pressure.
go. Okay. Can you give us advice on how we can find difference between a behavior problem and disability when we have no experience with children with disability? It's also a big question.
Can I just go back? Can I take a shot at
Yeah,
this?
please.
Very often we think disabled people are categorically different from non-disabled people. So when they have a behavior problem, we have the separate set of strategies to say, is this a behavior problem? Or is this a problem, issue around the environment? And we think, again, like we said in the keynote, you need to be special ed psychics and go, aha! This is a disability problem. Aha! This is an environmental issue. What we're saying, the key issue is that it doesn't matter. What's important is asking questions. So irrespective of whether the kid has a disability or is non-disabled, the key is to focus on questions.
It's kind of like we have to be detectives. And sometimes in our work as detectives, we need to go to that child's family, to other people who know that child. What is the meaning of this behavior if the child can't actually tell you themselves?
So, like we said in the keynote, asking what's up.
Mm-hmm.
There is not a separate question for disabled kids or non-disabled kids. What is the power of curiosity?
Yeah. All right. Can you give us, let's see. Oh, you have to scroll down again. Sorry.
All right.
All right. Yeah. Okay. Whoop. Since students with disabilities all process information at different times, how does that affect information given as a class? Or is instruction information always given individually? Just have a quick stab at that. I think that comes down to the whole idea of differentiated instruction that we talked about. You start with the...
They won't get that till the second.
Oh, geez, I just about gave us away. We're going to talk about that in the next section.
Give them a teaser about
a little teaser.
Maggie.
Well, you're gonna see a video of an interview that we did with our friend Erin Sheldon about her daughter Maggie, who has Angelman syndrome, and I think that will answer your question better than we can. So wait for it.
We'll leave it there.
We'll leave it there. Okay. Hi from California, Emma and Norm. Hi.
Hi.
You are both so amazing. Aw. What as educators do we need to do to change the most, and what would be the most helpful when we meet a child with a disability?
Let me try. I think the most important thing is to understand disability as diversity rather than a separate medical issue. I remember I was speaking at a school, junior high school, in Port Moody, BC, where they had enormous racial, cultural, and diversity in terms of religion, in terms of sexual orientation, in terms of race, etc. And the whole school administration had an intentional commitment to valuing all that diversity. And they talked about disability as just being one more expression of diversity. And when I was in there, I imagined myself as being 14 or 15 years old, going into that school, and what a relief it would have been rather than to be categorized as disabled versus non-disabled, to be seen as one of the groups of diverse students. And so in that multitude of diversity, I would have belonged.
Okay, next question. We hope we're doing okay with this. It's always a little difficult when you can't actually make contact with the person asking the question to ask some follow-up questions. That being said, how can we convince a denier? Okay, let me have a little bit of a go at that one. You know, sometimes we get accused in those of us who are proponents of inclusive education of only preaching to the choir. You know, preaching to the choir is really valuable because we have to find our allies. There are times when you're just not necessarily going to be able to convince someone who's really unconvinced. And it's almost like the tipping point, you know, and how many people are actually in favor of doing this and actually doing it that makes the difference.
You want me to? Yeah.
Do you want to talk about the math teacher? Or is that too long?
I will. But that's probably too long. I'm going to be a short answer. I was once in a workshop with a union lawyer talking about how you work with persuasion of society. And he had a 40-20-40 rule. And you can change it to 30-40-30 or whatever. But it's always three numbers. So let me work with 40-20-40. When you talk about inclusion, let's say 40% of your staff will be fully on board. And 40% will say you're absolutely,
out to lunch.
Out to lunch. You're ignoring the practicalities of school. 20% will be in the middle going, I'm not sure. The key is, his point was, as advocates, like moths drawn to light, we get drawn to that 40% of deniers. He said, no. Work on the middle. Work on the 20 or 30% who've not yet been convinced. As you work on that group, as that body expands, then the deniers will feel more and more pressure. So I think that's an important point.
Okay, next is a comment. Support can go a long way. As educators, we have to be willing to support our students on every level. Absolutely. And that said, we know what a tall order that is, and that teachers are being absolutely stretched to the limit, especially right now in a pandemic. It's amazing. And yes, we do need to be supportive to all our students and to be kind to one another and to, you're going to say something?
No, finish, and then I will.
All right. And to understand that this is a very tall order. And we understand the struggles involved in it.
I want to say two other things. I want to say that, first of all, yes, students need support, but teachers also need support. So you can't believe you're some type of educational superhero who can do this on your own.
And we're going to talk about that in the next session
yes.
in much more detail.
But, yeah.
Okay, I think we lost one question here. It kind of, I don't know what I'm doing here to get it to go down. Oh, no, we didn't. Okay, this is the next one. Hang on. Don't you love technology?
Going down.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Okay. Oh, too much. I know.
Let me. So one time in my fine motor control is better than Norman.
He's the techie in our group. All right. Thank you, Norm. I remember seeing you present at a VCOE over 20 years ago on the same topic. Although we have come a long way in inclusive practices in this community, unfortunately, we still seem to be very stuck in a pattern of requiring ability to dictate placement. As a principal for 17 years, we practiced reverse integration in our special education classroom, providing neurotypical children the opportunity to have a free preschool experience so we could provide our neurodiverse students with opportunities to learn with their peers. Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, that's
Not a question, it's a comment. All right. Yeah, what did I do here?
No, Andrew is already scrolled down.
Oh, all right. Okay. As teachers and adults, we have to learn to shift our mindset. Yeah. Change our perspective on the what ifs. Think, I wonder what's on their mind, instead of, okay, now I have to bring them back into the group. Reframing is a great positive tool. I can speak to that as a trained mediator, that reframing is one of the most powerful tools we have. How do we think about what we're seeing? And how do we actually talk to ourselves about what we're seeing? So we can reframe what we see as something negative. And I'm not talking about being Pollyanna here. I'm talking about holding some space to wonder. And I think that's what you've addressed here really, really well.
And curiosity.
And curiosity, to stay curious. When I was training as a mediator, I had a wonderful mentor. And she said to me, if there's two things that you can remember about being a good mediator, they are these: be infinitely curious and be specific. And I'll tell you, those two things have really served me well over the years.
Nice.
Do we have a next question?
Yeah, he's.
Oh, yeah. Okay. All right. Since students with disabilities, oh no, that's the same one we had.
All right.
Norman, Emma. This is Andrew.
Hello.
So we've got, hi guys. So we do have a question that has actually gotten quite a few upvotes, if you will. And that's any advice on connecting with and supporting students with disabilities during lockdown?
Wow.
Yeah. Let me add to that. In this way, in a strange way, a crisis could provide opportunity. And we've said for decades that one of the most important, let me speak for myself and then I'll generalize it. Probably the point of true liberation in my life came from meeting or seeing other powerful disabled adults who had
Me too.
And when you get a role model of a powerful, articulate, disabled adult, that changes your life. I can remember the first time I watched the movie My Left Foot, and that was the first time I saw a representation of a person with cerebral palsy who was a person of power. and that dramatically changed my life. So while you're in lockdown, rather than focusing simply on your curriculum, school, etc., see if you can engage powerful disabled advocates in Zoom calls to possibly, or even, introduce them to writing or videos. For disabled people, one of the resources we would highly recommend is Stella Young on TED Talks. All right, have disabled people.
I'm not your inspiration. Thank you very much. Stella Young, out of Australia.
Have disabled people watch for autistic people. There's a phenomenal website called Ask an Autistic.
With our friend and colleague, Amethyst Shaber.
So we think this is an opportunity to introduce your students to powerful, articulate, adult disabled advocates who can provide a new understanding of what it means to be disabled or autistic.
And there are a lot of blogs out there with people who are more than happy and willing to help. One of the ones that I would point you to in terms of autism that also has links to any number of people and other websites and other blog posts is our friend and colleague Leah Kelly's 30 Days of Autism. And that would be for you as an educator to go and look at and think about what might work, what might be valuable, and who might I want to be in contact with.
Until 11 o'clock.
Oh, is it? Okay.
Yeah. So I think we've reached the end of our time.
I went fast.
We hope this has been helpful.
Yeah. We want to wish you all the best of luck and thank you for having us at your conference. I wish we could actually see you. It's very weird doing it this way, but there we are. These are the times. Take care, everybody. Bye.